just on this topic of the trajectory and what may be the evolution, obviously that if I have you on my show or if anyone has you on their show, they're going to hear, kind of the highlights or the lowlights, as it might be, of Nick Fuentes. Like, here's what he said about black people, and here's what he said about Jews, and here's what he said about this group and that group and this group. And because you're on the air a lot, and because some of it is kind of an ironic humor that you have with your audience, which I think most people in real life is how they speak, and part of the appeal, if you're doing well on the internet, is the fact that you are being a real person. You're not presenting one fake artificial public face with a different private character. And I think that's given people, in one way that's been very good for you, it's been part of your appeal, but in another way it's given people a very easy way to demonize and attack you by taking these quotes that can sound not just very racist, but very almost like Nazi-like and a kind of an extermination rhetoric. And so let me just ask you, let's envision a world in which you have, let's say, quasi-dictatorial powers, which I think a lot of your followers ironically hope you have and some non-ironically hope that you have. What does that world look like in terms of, I don't mean people who are here illegally or even recent immigrants. You've been very clear about your advocacy of mass deportation, which is a mainstream conservative view. It's what Trump ran and won on. But what about minorities who have been in this country for decades or centuries, generations, Black Americans, Latino Americans, Asian Americans, gay people? Like, what is the ideal vision of America that Nick Fuentes would shape in terms of how those groups would be treated?
Well, I think that for people that have been here for generations, you got to recognize there's always been non-white groups that have lived in a sort of regional basis across the country, whether it's Asians living in California, Hispanics living in the Southwest, blacks living in the South because of slavery. I think that they should have the same rights and dignity as every other American. My only concern, and where it's born out of, the kind of nativist rhetoric, or even to that extent, white nationalist or white identitarian rhetoric, is the idea that the white American experience is going away. It's going extinct. You recognize that because of the demographic change in America, you have these ethnic enclaves from Latin America, from Asia, from Africa that are being set up all across the country. And it almost feels like those places they sort of they're more of a true representation of their home country than America is of what America used to be. In other words, it feels like going into certain neighborhoods in Minneapolis or in Ohio, that feels like a truer representation of Haiti or Somalia than most of America is to what America used to be 30 years ago. And so there does need to be something done with respect to that. And I think that what you might call that is something like voluntary segregation. People call it free association. People have talked about reversing the Civil Rights Act. My concern is not necessarily because we don't really live in America in a sense. We live in our neighborhood. America's a big country. It's always been a big country. The question is, can there be neighborhoods or cities or states where it still feels like America, where there's still mostly white people, still mostly Christians, still, bear some passing resemblance to what European civilization looked like for the past 1,000 years? That's sort of what I'm preoccupied with. And so I'm less concerned about, in the past, people have talked about an ethno-state or these kinds of things. The demographic change is baked in. At this point, there's millions upon millions of people that are not white that have been here for many years. If I could go in a time machine, I would undo this demographic change. We can't do that. I don't think it's practical, or I don't even think it'd be humane to try to reverse that at this point. On some level, America has to see itself no longer as a homogeneous republic, self-governing, and more like a true empire, more like a federalized system with a stark degree of multiracialism, ethnic and racial diversity. And I think we have to have that reflected in how the country's governed, how we manage relations between the races. I think that's something the government needs to undertake, is sort of an active management of the diversity. That Singapore does this, Ethiopia does this, many countries do it. America's not the same country as it was 100 years ago. We have to change to sort of reflect that fundamental change in the population. So that's sort of where I don't know if that's a great answer, but that's sort of how I think about it when I think about how we could all get along as a diverse nation.
I guess my question about that is, and you know this very well, if you go back and look over the last 100 years, which we can romanticize and idealize as this much greater time and better time of harmony and cultural cohesion, there was a big influx of all sorts of immigrants. I mean, people looked at Italians, and people looked at Irish, and people looked at Jews and Jewish immigrants, and people looked at, you know, pretty much every single one of these groups as distinctly un-American, as a completely foreign influence, importing very un-American ideas, loyalties to their foreign country. You know, when even John F. Kennedy became the first Catholic president, there was this sense of, oh, he's not really American. His principal allegiance is to the Vatican. A lot of the rhetoric about the newest immigrants was very much similar to the ones about the ones from 100 years ago. I grew up in South Florida. There was this huge Cuban immigrant community, and a lot of the first generation immigrants were completely unassimilated. You know, they never even learned English. To this day, you can go to the Miami airport and have a hard time finding someone who speaks English. But their kids, you know, Marco Rubio and those types, Ted Cruz, to some extent at least, you know, you can argue in those cases to which extent, but to a lot of them, they became super assimilated, super American. I think you see that with a lot of Indian immigrants, a lot of Muslim immigrants. These people start going to college, they become doctors and lawyers. A lot of them are secular. They seem American in terms of how they speak and how they behave. Like, what to you is the difference, other than just numbers maybe, between immigrants of 100 years ago and the immigrants of now?
Well, difference is race. The immigrants of 100 years ago were racially European. And, you know, there's sub-races in Europe. People get at that. They talk about how the WASP natives of America didn't take a shine to the Italians, Irish, Jews, Slavs, et cetera, that came in. And with the exception of Jews, I don't consider Jews, they're sort of a distinct group, but they were all white. Italians are white, Irish are white, and that's why it was easy for them to assimilate. You know, my ancestors, most of them were white. I have one grandfather who's Mexican. The rest of my grandparents are Irish and Italian. They look like the native people. They practice Christianity, a different flavor of it. They come from the same continent. They're racially white. And I do believe that our race is a part of our distinct identity. And the people that are coming in now, they're Indian, they're Chinese, they're Hispanic, they're racially different. And I think people have, rightfully so, a lot of reservations about America going from a white country to a not white country, a country that was 90% white to a country that may be 70% not white. It won't look the same. It won't feel the same. It won't be the same. You know, and these are people with a completely different heritage, different religion, language. They look different. They just are different. And I don't have a problem with them in themselves. I'm Catholic. So, you know, we believe that every human being is created by God. We do believe there's a universal community of human beings, but you still have China, you still have India, you still have the Middle East and Africa. If America becomes a not white country, it's almost like we lose what's ours. And moreover, we're also losing it in Europe too. The European countries, they're undergoing the same transformation. And so, you know, there's this idea that we're going to be a post-racial country and live in a post-racial world, but it feels like white people are the ones that are going to be erased. There's still going to be Indians, Africans, Chinese, Peruvians in a post-racial world, but there won't be any white people. There won't be any white nations. White people won't have power, and that's disconcerting for white people. I'm white. I feel white. I look white. I want to be around people that look like me. That makes me comfortable. That makes me feel at home. And I think there's something tragic and there's something lost if, you know, our homes are being erased. Neighborhoods are no longer filled with the same people, no longer the same heritage, culture, customs. It's sort of like our race and our countries are going extinct. And that is the part that really makes it different than 100 years ago.
Yeah, I get that. At the same time, you know, even going back to like the 70s and 80s into the 90s, there was this liberal utopian dream that the way that liberals were going to exercise political power for eternity, essentially, is they were going to import enough immigrants from enough different countries in Latin America and elsewhere. And these people, by their very culture, by their very nature, were going to be more attracted to liberal politics than to conservative politics, which was hostile to them, and that it would essentially deliver to the Democratic Party and American liberalism kind of a permanent majority. And as you know, it turns out that a lot of these immigrants shocked a lot of these Democratic strategists because they're increasingly migrating to American conservatism. Huge amounts of supporters like them got behind President Trump, not Kamala Harris, not Joe Biden, not Barack Obama. Increasingly, they feel alienated by this kind of left-wing multiculturalism and much more in line with what people might call American conservative values. Has that surprised you, and it does in any way undermine these assumptions you have about the ability of different races to come in and really assimilate into the American ideal?
It has been surprising. It has. I would say, though, I think you might be overstating it a little bit, or other people might be overstating it. Really, the demographic that's come far in that regard is Hispanics. I don't know the numbers on Asians in 24, but it's not happening with African Americans, Black Americans as opposed to Africans from Africa. It's not. I don't believe it's really happening with East Asians or Asians. It's really only happening with Hispanics. And I think that Hispanics, unlike Asians and Africans, I'm not just saying this because I'm ethnically Mexican also, but Hispanics, people say there is some proximity with white people. A lot of Hispanics have a kind of white phenotype, and many of them see themselves as white. Some people say that's me, but I would say that's a lot of Hispanics. They maybe identify as white in a certain way, and maybe that explains why they were able to vote for the deporter-in-chief Donald Trump in 2024. I will say, though, it is a bit surprising. That was a big part of the thinking 10 years ago, is that, like you say, they're going to come here, they're going to vote Democrat forever, and the Democrats are going to increase the open borders. And, it's a sort of compounding effect, always more immigration. And so that's been a little bit surprising. But I would say that when you look at Trump's governance, now that he is really fulfilling, or by appearances fulfilling, mass deportations, the Hispanics are turning on him. And so the Hispanics that turned out in record numbers for a Republican president in 24, if you look at the available polling, now that there's this media perception that Trump is enforcing deportations and going door to door, I discount the extent of this, but that's the perception. Now Hispanics are turning on Trump, and many of the attitudes on immigration are changing. And I would say beyond that, I don't know that the immigrants ever fully and really assimilate. You look at Black Americans, for example, they've been here for 400 years. Are African Americans assimilated? I would argue that they really represent a kind of distinct identity from white America. There's white America, there's Black America. Those are two completely different worlds. They talk differently, they act differently, different culture, vote differently. And you could argue, have they even assimilated? It's been 400 years. Obviously, they have a unique experience, but I think that politics...
Nick, just on that, I just want to interject that there were several years, and you may even think this, but certainly for several years, you were a very vocal and unironic advocate of the view that the political savior for the United States was not Donald Trump or any other white politician, but was Kanye West, who emerges very much out of Black culture, is an icon of Black musical culture and just kind of Black iconography in general. And this was the person who you believe, he became a very close friend of yours, still might be. You have a great deal of admiration for him. And not just admiration personally, but you really believe that politically he was the most promising agent for the kind of political and social change that you crave. Is that just aberrational, or does that say something about the integration of Black Americans into American culture after so many centuries?
Well, I think that there can be cooperation, but I would say that Ye, that's his name change now, he really is distinct. He does look at white people differently, I think, than Black people. I think that his politics were distinct because he is Black. Now, we happen to come into an alliance because of our agreement about confronting the Jewish media, about confronting Israel, and even upsetting the apple cart for Trump and the GOP. I think we both recognized that would be useful as native-born Americans. But just because we could come together on a political basis, I don't think it discounts that there's still there is still a bridge. Or you could say there needs to be a bridge built between us because we come from such different worlds. We're both from Chicago. He's from Hyde Park. I'm from LaGrange Park. Different worlds, different politics. And we probably agree, him and I, maybe on 50% of the issues. And one of them is a very unique issue. So I don't know that that's really a contradiction in terms. I think it just speaks to the fact that he is a unique individual. I don't think anyone would disagree with that in general, but I don't think that changes the fact that people of different races have very different politics in America, and I think that proceeds from their race.
Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.